We have Jessica Almy, who's the Policy Director at the Good Food Institute, which you've already heard a little bit about this weekend. She oversees GFI's work to create a better future of food through regulatory and statutory reform in Washington. And she came to GFI through the Center for Science and Public Interest, where she served as the Deputy Director of Nutrition Policy. And before working for CSPI, she worked for the DC-based law firm many of you are familiar with, Meyer, Glitzenstein, and Crystal. She holds a JD from New York University School of Law and an MS in Animals and Public Policy from Tufts University. And she's a member of the Bar of New York and Washington. Please join me in welcoming our wonderful guests.
Green light, all right. Well, thank you so much for having me here at this conference. If it's all right, I'm going to join amongst the crowd here. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about how the reducitarian movement got started and how I think it's a useful sort of paradigm for thinking about animal issues and all of the great work that all of us here are doing today. So I grew up in Staten Island, New York. How many of you have been to Staten Island, New York? Okay, oh wow, more than I expected. How many of you have been to Staten Island and did something else besides ride the ferry back and forth from Manhattan? Fewer hands, but still an impressive number. That's great to hear. I'm home. As you know, Staten Island is not known to be thought of as a particularly progressive place in terms of New York City. There are not a ton of plant-based restaurants like there are here in Chicago, for example, Veggie Grill, among many others. But one of the parts I loved about growing up in Staten Island was that there was a lot of nature. And as a young child, I sort of fell in love with the natural world and also, of course, the animals that were living in those spaces. So when I got to college, I was your typical environmentalist. I told people that they should recycle, that they should compost, that they should ride their bicycle or walk to work, not use too much plastic. But it wasn't until much later in college that I made the connection between factory farming and many of the issues that I care about. I was actually on a plane on my way to present some undergraduate research on climate change with some fellow students, and a friend of mine handed me a book called The Ethics of What We Eat by Peter Singer and Jim Mason. And it was a little bit awkward because at that time I was actually eating a hamburger. So I think my friend might have handed it to me in jest, but I persisted and read the book front to back during that flight. And it really blew my mind. I just had never thought about how factory farming was responsible for so many of the issues that I cared about: deforestation, biodiversity loss, climate change, and of course, on top of that, the tremendous animal suffering that we see in factory farms. 9 billion land animals in the United States, 70 billion worldwide, cows, chickens, all sorts of animals that are really no different from my beloved Toby. And not to mention heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and so on associated with people just simply not eating enough fruits and vegetables and eating way too many animal products. And so my mind was sort of blown, and I was the kind of person who wanted to live a life that was in line with my values. And so it wasn't too long after that I decided to be a vegetarian, sort of on my way to being vegan. And for the most part, this went really well. I felt energetic, I was happy, making decisions that I felt were in line with my values. My acne cleared up, I had all sorts of energy. Life was beautiful. But there really was one problem, and that is that I wasn't perfect about it. There were times in very complex social situations where I found myself, as they say, falling off the plant-based bandwagon. And this isn't that surprising because I'm a person, and like most people, I make food choices not necessarily all the time based on ethics or environmental issues or even my own health. Most people choose food based on price, taste, and convenience, and to some extent, social norms, what other people are eating around them. And so I remember one instance, for example, being at Thanksgiving with my family at the dinner table, and I have this mountain, a cornucopia of veggies on my plate, and my family is sort of cajoling me into partaking in the tradition of eating some turkey. And so for whatever reason, I'm not a perfect person, I cave, and I take a tiny piece of turkey and I put that turkey on my plate, and then I pop that piece of turkey in my mouth. And immediately, as siblings will do, my sister Jennifer says to me, "I thought you were a vegetarian, Brian." And I remember in that moment not having the words to articulate how I felt. But in essence, I felt annoyed because here I was doing a relatively good job. I had significantly reduced the amount of animal products in my diet. Maybe I was eating a pound or two of meat a year, but everyone else at the table was like the average American. They were eating well over 200 pounds of meat a year, and so it seemed so strange for someone to criticize me for not being perfect when at least I had taken the first step. I had another example where I was in Staten Island. I'm at IHOP. A friend of mine leaves over a piece of bacon. I eat the bacon, and they sort of made fun of me for it. And perhaps because I identify as a Jewish vegetarian, that added another layer of humor and complexity to it. But all this is to say I found myself in these sort of complex social situations where I wasn't perfect. And so I said, look, I don't know any vegans or vegetarians, but if what people mean by vegan and vegetarian is being perfect all the time, then that doesn't describe who I am in any area of my life. And so that word doesn't work for me personally. Now, it turns out I later have met many vegans and vegetarians, and that's not what they mean. So it's worth saying that. But I know the experience of trying to do my absolute best and falling short of this notion of being perfect all the time. And so I went home and I looked up various words that might describe who I am, and I found words like mostly vegetarian and flexitarian and semi-vegetarian. And they all describe people who primarily eat plant-based foods with respect to their own diet, maybe occasionally including animal products, and that certainly described myself at the time. But I didn't love these words in part because they felt static. I felt like I was on a journey. I was on my way somewhere, and these words described me as in this moment and who I was rather than where I was trying to head. And perhaps more importantly, most people are not flexitarians or mostly vegetarians. Most people eat well over 200 pounds of meat a year, and I wanted them to have some goalpost that was manageable. Wherever they were at, I wanted them to understand that they had to significantly reduce the amount of animal products in their diet, even if they weren't yet a flexitarian or semi-vegetarian. And so a friend of mine, we're in college, we're philosophizing about what kind of word we should come up with or movement or what can we do to contribute. And it took us some time, but eventually we came up with a term to describe everyone, as many people as possible, who were reducing the amount of red meat, poultry, seafood, eggs, and dairy in their diet. And more profound, it was meant to sort of encourage a movement of people that no matter where they were at, that they would take a stand against rejecting factory farming and agree that in order to achieve all of the goals that we all share, we're going to have to at least significantly reduce societal consumption of animal products. And so it may seem like we didn't take all that much time to come up with a word to describe someone who reduces the amount of animal products in their diet, but we did, and we landed on the term reducitarian, and it is meant to do exactly that. Now, it's important to recognize that in my mind, vegans and vegetarians are also reducitarians. They have reduced the amount of animal products in their diet. It's just that they've done such a good job that they've reduced their consumption of animal products to zero. But this allows us to recognize that we have a lot in common with people who are not yet vegan or vegetarian or flexitarian. If we're willing to broaden our language and our camps to include as many people as possible, they can all fall under this umbrella term of reducitarian. And so there are at least 4 sort of main core tenets of the reducitarian concept that I think are useful for having conversations around what I imagine is our shared goal of at least ending factory farming and significantly reducing societal consumption of animal products. So the first is that it's not all or nothing. We tend to think of meat consumption as an all or nothing premise, that you're either a vegan or an omnivore, but we know this is not true. Obviously, we make food choices at least several times a day, and every single plant-based meal we have is one worth celebrating. So it's my vote that we move away from thinking about purity and perfection and focus on encouraging people to recognize that they should be the best possible versions of themselves that they can be. Now, just to drive the point home, I'm getting married next year, which is very exciting, and my fiancée Isabel and I are having a vegan wedding. And so I went home and I told my parents that this was the case, and my mom said to me, "What are the people who don't eat that food going to eat, or don't eat that kind of food going to eat?" Now, as is often the case with my parents, first I laugh, and then I usually realize there's some wisdom in what they're saying. And what my mom was saying is that in her mind, vegan food is only for vegans. And think about how problematic that is, because if we're actually going to end factory farming and significantly reduce societal consumption of animal products, we're going to have to get people who don't identify as vegan to eat vegan food. This happens to me all the time. I go to a restaurant that's not vegan, I order a vegan meal, I'm a friendly guy, and the person says to me, "Are you vegan?" And that is a problem, because you don't have to be vegan to enjoy vegan food. This is not an all or nothing premise, and I think we'd be wise to recognize that. And of course, if we could get the average person who eats 200 pounds of meat in the United States to cut back, let's say, 10%, which would be a reduction of about 20 pounds, that would be more significant than getting a person like my old self who ate 5 or 10 pounds of meat a year to go 100% vegetarian. It's just the simple math. If we're going to advance our shared goal, we're going to have to move the billions of people in the direction that we want. And so again, it's not an all or nothing premise. The next is that incremental change is worthy of celebration. Of course, there are going to be people who are inspired to go vegan or vegetarian overnight, and that's something that we should celebrate. But there's lots of evidence to suggest that when people make big changes immediately, it's less sustainable in the long term. Perhaps it's why 84% of people who go vegan stop going vegan at one point in their life. And so I think when we're thinking about this ultimate goal, whether you want the end of animal agriculture altogether or you're excited about simply ending factory farming, we have to recognize that with respect to personal dietary change, it's going to be an incremental progress for many people, and that is something to be celebrated. And of course, there are lots of different strategies that people can use. Meatless Monday or Green Monday, which I find to be effective in the environmental community, weekday vegetarian, and so on. Now, this is a learning experience for me over the past few years, but there's a saying that I like that what you put in your mouth may not be as important as what comes out of it. And what I interpret that to mean is for a long time, much of the movement has focused on personal dietary choice. And what we're realizing is that it's really hard to get people to change their behaviors. And so if we're going to advance this shared goal, we're going to have to be comfortable using institutional levers. And I'm really excited to be here because I've learned so much about the legal and policy initiatives that we could put forth. And many of them are highly problematic and single-issue campaigns and specific. But this puts us all on the path of at least ending factory farming and reducing societal consumption of animal products. And so we should really celebrate any incremental change that is in the favor of animals or the planet and people's health, etc. The third is that all motivations matter. Whether someone wants to end factory farm because they care about the environment, their health, food justice issues, or of course, like many of us, around issues related to animal cruelty, puts us all on the same team. And we should be comfortable using different messages that are going to resonate with different people. I wish my dad cared about the planet. I wish he thought climate change was a thing. But he doesn't. And he doesn't care that much about animals. But when I tell him that I want him to be on this planet longer because I love him, that I'm worried about how heart disease runs in his family, or because he has type 2 diabetes, that message resonates with him. So whatever messaging we can use that resonates with the general public, no matter what kind of work or activism we're doing, I strongly encourage you to let go or accept that you may not have the same motivation or passion as another person, but that doesn't mean that we can't leverage that message and, more importantly, work together to advance our shared goals. Now, this one for me is most important. We're all on the same team. I've had some interesting conversations, debates with people over the years. No matter what you're doing, your philosophy around vegan eating, whether or not you identify as a vegan right now, we need each other badly. It's easy to forget that we are a rare type of people, that most people don't sit around all day thinking about how we're going to end the most insane abuses of our time. And so it's so easy to find differences between one another and occasionally get caught up in what's often referred to as horizontal hostility. This idea that on occasion we engage in what's Freud referred to as the narcissism of small differences, that we elevate these differences to such a degree, despite how minor they are, that we lose sight of all we have in common. There's lots of examples of this in social movements. We saw this in our last political cycle in some respect to people who are a fan of Hillary or Bernie Sanders, who had a lot in common relative to Donald Trump. But I think as a movement, we need to do everything we possibly can to resist horizontal hostility. And I want to be clear with you, I sometimes engage in horizontal hostility. It's not easy, it's really hard, and I apologize to anyone over the years who I've done that to. This is something that is an ongoing challenge that we have to be mindful of. We have to see people with good intentions and acknowledge that even if we don't have the same ultimate vision or we don't share the same exact diet, we're still on the same team. So I really believe that if we work together and we acknowledge our shared commonality and don't get too caught up in our differences, and if we use all of the different tools at our disposal, whether that be focusing on individual dietary change, or legal, or policy, or food service, or of course what we'll hear so much about with respect to food technology, I do believe that we will be able to relegate factory farming to where it belongs. And that is without a doubt in the dustbin of history. Thank you.
To debate him, right? Well, I don't have a mic on, so you're going to get me up here. But thank you, Brian. That was a really great introduction to this conversation. And if you did come expecting a debate, I'm afraid you're going to be sorely disappointed. But I hope that we do give you food for thought. And both Brian and I are trying to keep our presentations brief so that we hope that you will have lots of questions. And if you don't, we have questions for each other, so we can just keep talking up here. But I hope that some of the things we're talking about will raise questions with you. And I have to say, thank you for being here at the last session of this conference and sticking around. One thing that's a real gift about being in the last session, A, you get the most dedicated people at your session. And second, B, that you can build on all of the things that you've heard during this conference. And we have had an extraordinary conference. I want to thank the conference organizers and the Animal Legal Defense Fund for all the work that they've put into having this conference. And there's so much that we've been talking about that I really think is important and really I'm building on with my remarks to you today. So, I think particularly the panel yesterday with Miyoko and Christy Legale and Amanda Howell talking about solutions really sets the stage very nicely for the remarks I'm going to make today. And even the session that was before us here in this room, where Kathy was talking about cricket farming and how, feeding a world population is causing people to do some pretty crazy things that exploit animals, I think also sets the stage. So the Good Food Institute is a nonprofit organization. We've been around for about 3 years. And we are really about using markets to transform the food supply to a humane, sustainable, and healthy food supply. So what you're going to hear me talking about will echo some of what Brian was talking about, because neither of us are particularly focused on personal dietary choice as the be-all and end-all. We really want to use systems to change the choices that are available to people, and to change, when you change that choice architecture, you change the outcomes that you get. So this is briefly what I'm going to go through. What do people actually say and do? How can we replace meat? Because Brian's with the Reducitarian Foundation, so obviously I'm with the Replacitarian Good Food Institute. And then I am a lawyer, so I'll talk to you a little bit about the law and some interesting developments recently, and then answer the question, so really, is this about reducing or replacing? So this probably doesn't surprise you. Many people report they're eating less meat. Many people do not want slaughterhouses. More than half of Americans say they don't want slaughterhouses. And when this research was first conducted, it was conducted by an organization that was seen as having sort of a carrot in the salad. What's the dog in the fight? Humane analogy. But people who had wanted the research to turn out one way. And so Oklahoma State University replicated the same research and found that 50% of Americans or more do not want slaughterhouses. And yet, many of us eat the products of slaughterhouses, or if we ourselves don't, we have close family members and friends who do. And the global demand for meat is on the rise. So despite consumers, knowing that this is a harmful system, despite dire warnings about climate change, despite an aversion to slaughterhouses, people are continuing to eat meat, not just in the United States, but globally. And we think about this from a global perspective. And Brian already took my line, but why do people make food choices? They make food choices based on price, taste, and convenience. And the most important of these is convenience. So there's a lot of really interesting research from supermarkets about what motivates people to make food choices as they're going through the supermarket. And you may know that a supermarket has 40,000 different food items, and that's just kind of a normal supermarket. So if you go to Wegmans, whoa, so many more. And people need to make choices. They're not going to pick up every one of those 40,000 items and look at the nutritional quality and look at where it's sourced from and think about whether it contains animal products. We operate a lot of times on shortcuts. And there's an ample body of evidence that the choices that are before us and the ones that are most salient for various reasons, typically because of how they're merchandised in the store, are the ones who sell the best. And so there's a whole industry around getting your product in the best part of the supermarket in order to induce purchases. And my former employer, the Center for Science and the Public Interest, has done a lot of really great thinking on this topic. So if we want to change the way people eat, we can't just convince them about slaughterhouses and climate change. We also have to make sure that there are alternatives that are cheaper, tastier, and more convenient, or at least equally. So then we're left with a need to make meat without animals. And as you heard Christy talk about yesterday, this is most certainly possible with plant-based meats. I'm going to talk to you about both plant-based meat and what we call clean meat, which is also called cell-based meat or cultured meat, or occasionally, disparagingly, lab-grown meat. We do not use that term. So plant-based meat, as Christy talked about yesterday, is products that, and they can come from plants or fungus. We decided not to go with fungus-based meat as a separate category. But these are foods that are designed to replace animal-based meat, either standalone products or within recipes. And, we really do see a future that's much like what Miyoko was talking about, where there's the animal-based meat and there's the plant-based meat, and they're both equally meat. Clean meat, on the other hand, is animal cells. So this is animal meat, but it's made in a completely different way. So it's made from cell culture rather than slaughter. There is no slaughterhouse with clean meat. You may know that meat is comprised of various cell types. And so if you can grow those cells outside of an animal, then you have meat without slaughter. And this is not a new idea. Back in 1932, Winston Churchill talked about the absurdity of growing the whole animal when all you want is the breast or the wing. And I would add to this that the absurdity of growing the whole animal who has a brain and a nervous system and can suffer in order to eat a part of the body that we've, grown accustomed to eating and that we're culturally assimilated to do. And it's absurd to do that if there is a way to grow without the suffering. And so basically, this is one schematic of what clean meat production looks like. Right now, it is not at commercial scale, so this is our scientists' envisioning of what it would look like when it's scaled up for commercial sale. But basically, it starts with that tank in the corner where you take a cell or some cells that you've taken from an animal, and you put them in a tank. This is usually done with the removal of the cells as a biopsy that's about the size of a sesame seed. You can also do this with cells from a feather. So you just need animal cells to start, and you can coax the cells to be muscles or fat or connective tissue. You grow them in what is called bioreactors, also can be called a cultivator. And we recycle the media, which is really the food that the cells are using to grow, much the same as the basic building blocks of food that we feed to animals or we feed to ourselves. At the next stage, you want there to be some differentiation. You don't want a film of meat. Nobody wants to eat that. That's going to be gross. But you want something that's got depth and structure. And so we use things called scaffolds, which is just a technical term for something that the cells will grow on and help deliver nutrients to the cells. This gives it the texture. A lot of the scaffolding materials that the companies are thinking about using are already used in the food supply, but safe, and are consumed safely every day. and eventually you get a final product, which is a meatball or a salmon steak or a chicken nugget. So this is all very exciting, but it's not without obstacles. So for you lawyers in the room, we're going to talk, and law students, we're going to talk about law. Just this past year, there has been monumental activity on both the plant-based and clean meat side. Probably more activity in 2018 than ever before, which makes it a really exciting time to be Director of Policy at the Good Food Institute. So early this year, the U.S. Cattlemen's Association filed a petition where they asked the USDA to regulate meat labels. They wanted the USDA to use its labeling authority to crack down in its policy book on the bad use of meat terms on things that are not from slaughtered animals. And if you take a look at this rationale, I mean, first of all, they're calling plant-based meat synthetic. Secondly, clean meat is lab-grown. But the rationale that the cattlemen give is that it will compete against the products that they are producing. So they want the government to intervene on private labels and to censor labels in order to give them a competitive advantage in the marketplace. We weren't having it, of course. So we argued that this is outside of the scope of the agency's authority. For starters, FDA regulates plant-based foods, so not sure why they've petitioned USDA on that side. But also, the USDA's labeling authority is really about the health and well-being of consumers. It's not intended to privilege one industry over another. And that there has been policy precedent where USDA has declined to use its labeling authority to privilege one form of production over another form of production or one geographic area over another. Further, USDA invests in lots of innovation. So the cattlemen actually wanted to look at this image of traditionality as being sort of the benchmark for what makes real meat, which directly contradicts the kinds of things that USDA is doing. So, they're doing things with feeding calves, for example, and in order to reduce risk of Jones disease, which is like Crohn's disease, but in calves. And, those new ways are not traditional. So enacting or kind of enshrining a notion of traditionality into labeling conventions would inhibit innovation. And it would put USDA in this position where it has to police traditionality. And most importantly, and this really touches on what Amanda was saying yesterday with the Missouri litigation, it violates the First Amendment. So producers have a First Amendment right to communicate with consumers using terms that consumers understand, and the government cannot restrict that without an important interest and ensuring that it's the least restrictive way of proceeding. And then I will not go into much detail on this because Amanda did talk about it yesterday, but happy to answer questions about this Missouri litigation. We worked with the Animal Legal Defense Fund and others to oppose it when this law, when it was legislation, unfortunately were outgunned in the state of Missouri and became law, and we have sued over it. We are both plaintiffs and counsel in the case, so we're joined by Tofurky as co-plaintiff and ACLU of Missouri and ALDF as co-counsel. And now, on clean meat, it's been very interesting. So a year ago, if I were speaking to you, one of the questions that several people in the audience would invariably ask is, who has authority over clean meat? Is it USDA, because it's clearly meat, or is it FDA, which regulates the rest of the food supply? And this question is not clear-cut, because USDA's authority to regulate meat really comes from its oversight of slaughterhouses. And if you look at the regulatory and statutory definitions that are important, there is reference to slaughter, but that's also how we've traditionally understood meat and how meat has traditionally been produced in this country. But just this summer, FDA hosted a public meeting looking at the safety aspects of clean meat, which many people took as an assertion of the agency's authority to regulate clean meat. And they talked at this public meeting about all of the different kinds of novel food technologies that FDA regulates that give them the expertise they need in order to ensure the safety of clean meat. And there was recently a deadline for written comments. Of course, we submitted, as did, I think, ALDF and many other organizations who are probably represented in this room. And kind of simultaneous with all that, the USDA and the FDA were both called to the White House and got a talking to from the White House. And so now we see that USDA and FDA together are convening a public meeting, which is in about a week. And they'll be talking about regulatory issues as well as labeling issues. And there is a upcoming deadline for written comments. So if there are folks in the room who are interested in putting your opinions in, I'd be happy to talk to you. And I know that several animal protection organizations are likely going to be submitting comments during this comment period as well. So of course, my solution is reduce and replace. We don't get the debate that we were hoping for, I'm sorry. We do think of this sort of in terms of systems, though. And so when I'm thinking about reducing, I'm really thinking about things like blended products that allow consumers to eat burgers, beef burgers, with smaller impact on animals and the environment. So this is an example from Sonic. And of course, replacing. Our goal is to make that without all of the attendant harms that come from conventional meat production. So here's my contact information. I hope you all have lots of questions. We've given you food for thought. We'll try to keep it brief and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you both. So we do have time for questions. If people want to come up to the mics, if you're able to ask questions.
Can I kick off a question for
Please,
Brian?
while people are
Okay.
thinking about it, yeah.
So Brian, I want to know how the reducitarian movement thinks about clean meat. I've personally been vegan for more than 20 years, but I have every plan to eat clean meat once it's on the market. Do you think that would be a step backwards?
I don't think it would be a step backwards. I want to make the world a better place, and I just simply see factory farming as an atrocity on our planet. And so in my brain, anything that is not factory farming is a step in the right direction. Even if you're supportive, like I am, about clean meat, we know that we're not going to be able to scale clean meat immediately such that we'll be able to provide clean meat to the billions of people at the current levels of consumption that they're eating. And so I do think that even if we want a world in which people are eating lots of animal products, but they come from cellular agriculture, we're going to need to significantly reduce the amount of animal products that people consume regardless of the source. I think many people here would be excited if people ate broccoli instead of clean meat. I mean, we want people to eat plant-based foods because we know that those foods are really healthy, particularly whole foods. But I think the reality is that, I grew up, on occasion, my parents would tell me to eat fruits and vegetables, and I really wanted the hamburgers and the chicken nuggets. And so I think if we're going to really solve all of these issues that we care about, we're going to have to meet people where they are, and that means providing people with animal products, perhaps produced without the animal in the equation.
Thank you, both of you. Those were both really great summaries and really great insight. So thank you. I had just one question about the lawsuit in Missouri. There are obviously a lot of plant-based meat companies and have been for a long time, including Tofurky. How did you kind of form the coalition around having Tofurky be the plaintiff, or did it just come from them? And how does it, in the case of suing, how does it involve or affect other plant-based meat companies?
Thanks, Christy. So it's interesting, we did work with other plant-based meat companies to oppose the legislation. One of the things that happened, and I can't remember whether Amanda talked about this yesterday, was that the state of Missouri passed this law. It was the last day that the governor was in office. He was being forced out, and he signed a whole bunch of stuff on his way out the door, and it was in this ag omnibus bill, and it had been championed by his supporters, and so he signed it on the way out of office. And there's a real lack of clarity around the law, so it makes it unlawful to misrepresent a product as meat if it's not from a slaughtered animal. And that left a lot of people wondering, okay, so whose behavior does it criminalize? What does it mean to misrepresent a product as meat? Because no one thinks they are doing that right now. They're all completely complying with FDA labeling requirements. And so the state of Missouri did come out with an enforcement memo that talks about the need for both a modifier and a disclosure. So the State Department of Agriculture has said that if you call your product plant-based beefy crumbles, made entirely from plants, you're probably fine with the state. Now, this is hugely problematic because it is not the only state. The state is not the only entity that can enforce this law. All of the local prosecutors can as well. So, any enforcement memo from the state only has limited impact. Plus, it's an enforcement memo, which we all know can be rescinded as easily as it was created. And so there were companies like Tofurky who looked at that enforcement memo and looked at this law and said, even if we are currently meeting the requirements of this enforcement memo, this law is wrong and we don't want it to spread to other states. We don't want this to become the norm. We don't want a patchwork of laws that we're going to have to comply with. And so I think Tofurky was really brave in standing up because a lot of other plant-based companies felt like there had been a concession that the state had made. But Tofurky, on principle, said, we're not going to stand for this law. And so then it was, we'd been lobbying with ALDF in opposition to the law. So that was a clear, an obvious partnership. And we were really fortunate to have the ACLU of Missouri very interested in this topic. I think we were connected to them like 4 different ways. Lots and lots of people told us we should work together on this litigation, which goes to speak to sort of the amazing community that we're in. And I think it's really important from GFI's perspective to stay involved because this does affect plant-based producers, but it also very clearly criminalizes clean meat labels of the future. It is very hard to think about how you might label clean meat in a way that conveys to consumer the essential characteristics of that product without using meat or meat terms on the label. And so because the clean meat companies are all sort of in very early stages, or at least that part of their business is in a very early stage, GFI thought it was important to ensure that their interests were represented in this litigation as well.
Thank you.
What's your opinion on, if you don't pay for something, like that's meat or animal products, but like it's right in front of you, like say it's at a party or it's at Thanksgiving, what's your opinion on just eating that? Because, hey, what are you gonna do? Somebody already paid for it, it's already there.
You start, I'll go next.
That's a really great question. I once emailed Peter Singer asking him this exact question. I was in a situation where there were animal products presented to me that I didn't expect, and I sort of either had to throw them out or not partake in them. And his reply was that we don't want to send signals to other people that it is acceptable to eat animal products, and therefore we should try our best to avoid eating animal products if people are kind of aware that this is happening. But if you're 99.9% vegan and someone hands you a cookie and you don't want to have a conversation about whether it has honey or eggs in it and you want to pop the cookie in your mouth, I mean, there's a small, very, very small percentage of people who are vegan who are the vegan police, and they're going to come after you. And the majority of vegans and vegetarians that I've gotten to know over the years are very friendly and understanding people. And so my advice to you or someone else who you might know that might be asking that question is really not to worry about it that much and focus on enjoying the party and telling people about all the plant-based foods that you're eating that are perhaps not in that moment.
Yeah, I basically agree with that. I think, when I look at systems, those sort of incidental things don't register. So, if we're really looking to change the way the food supply works, that has very little impact on the food supply. On a personal note, I have, I have a daughter who's turning 13 this month, and when I was pregnant with her and I was talking to my husband about how we were going to raise her, we agreed that she was going to be vegan except for birthday parties because our rationale was the cake's already been purchased. We don't want her to feel left out. Birthdays are special celebrations. And then she was born, and the first couple of years there weren't any birthday parties. And then all of a sudden it was like a birthday party every weekend. We realized that our solution was not at all workable, that it would totally erode the values we were trying to instill in our daughter. And it turned out that families were lovely. There were dairy-free kids and kosher kids and whatever, and it was no big thing. So practically speaking, that approach has not worked at all for me in my life, but I think, from a systemic perspective, I think I don't see problems.
Thank
So I just had a question on marketing. When you go to a grocery store, at least in Utah, you'll find all the vegan food and vegetarian food in one section. So you won't have, for example, the burgers, the meat-free burgers in the burger section. You'll have them in the one little section. So is that an actual marketing thing where the non-meat producers can't pay enough to get into the regular areas, or is that some idea of the stores to just keep it very limited?
So typically, it's a result of the fees that companies are able to pay and the way that the supermarkets have structured their stores. So there's a really great report that I worked on when I was at CSPI on slotting fees. It's called Rigged. We hired an investigative journalist to get into the details of these complex financial arrangements between stores and suppliers. But one of the things we learned in that research is that the health food section of the store is one of the cheaper places to actually get in. I think, Miyoko said something, and she used a really evocative word yesterday about being, stuck in that section of the store. I don't remember the word she used, but I do think that it makes your product visible to vegetarians and vegans, and so it may be an intentional choice by some producers. But some of them are just not able to compete with the big dairy and meat companies. There are exceptions. And I think a lot of the movement that we've seen around plant-based meat and a lot of the aggression that we've seen from, particularly from the cattlemen's groups, tends to be because Beyond Meat is merchandised in the meat case of most supermarkets. I met with a state farm bureau fairly recently, and they actually were the ones who brought up this idea of fighting meat labels to the American Farm Bureau, and I asked them, why are you upset about these products? Do you think people think they're meat? And the answer was no. We think that we have created all this goodwill around meat, and these products taste really good, and they're being merchandised right next to our things in the case. But as the lawyers here can tell you, labels have nothing to do with merchandising in the supermarket, so it's kind of a red herring, I think.
My question is specifically about cell-based meat. I've been curious as to government subsidies, and if anybody has done research on when this takes off, will they then be able to be qualified for the government subsidy that takes some of that money away from the animal-based meat producers?
That is a really great and complex question. It has a complex answer. The Greenfield Project is an organization that has done a lot of work on subsidies, and I understand in the next week or two they're going to be putting out a lot of information on how the government subsidizes conventional animal agriculture. It's really complex. There's not one pot of money that you can point to. And right now, with clean meat, our primary focus has been on trying to get R&D funding for some of the foundational research that's going to help bring this to market more quickly. And so we had, 2018 has been an incredible year. We had the first ever congressional briefing on clean meat. And we talked, and it was hosted by the House R&D Caucus. So Republican and a Democrat, co-chairs of that caucus, wanted to bring people together to talk about clean meat. And we couldn't fit everybody in the room. It was, there were people sitting on the floor and people who on the other side of the doors who couldn't get in. So incredible interest on Capitol Hill. But there are a lot of open questions about how this will fit into the economy and how we can ensure that it's on a level playing field once it does. I think most important is getting it to market efficiently while ensuring consumer safety and confidence. Second most important is labeling and ensuring that this industry can use terms that consumers understand. But also, I think there's a good question about how it's going to compete. So, for example, the USDA has checkoff programs, for beef, for example, where each producer pays into this fund on a per head of cattle basis, and then that pot of money is used ostensibly for advertising. We've seen it being used for anti-competitive purposes, particularly the Egg Bureau with Just Mayo and egg-free mayo, but that's an aside. How do you assess that for clean meat if there's no heads of cattle to be assessing? And if they're not part of that fund, does that mean USDA doesn't have an obligation to be promoting that form of agriculture? So these are very good and important questions, and the reason that we need more people working on these issues. Thank you for your question.
So both of you seem to be okay, and that's fine, with a world in which animals are still used, in just the practical sense of the word used, for consumption in some way, shape, or form. And I'm just wondering, I mean, it's clearly going to be less than what we currently have. What numbers do you have in mind when you say, okay, we still need some animals around, whether it's for the clean meat, or whether it's because people aren't just willing to give it up and you want to be practical about it. And then along with the clean meat side of it, how do you see those animals that are still going to be needed for the biopsies to grow the meat? Who raises those? Is it like those are at the farm sanctuaries and then just sometimes they take the biopsies? Or is those going to be part and parcel of the cell culture industry? Like they have a very small herd that they keep for that purpose?
Can I take the first part?
Sure.
I was thinking about this question with respect to Seth's opening presentation, which is one I was really inspired by, particularly that last slide with the last slaughterhouse and that image of there being a monument on the Capitol. And I spoke to Seth after, and I think sometimes we get caught up in these sort of ultimate vision questions. And what I mean by that is when someone asks me what's my sort of ultimate goal or where I'm headed, I usually just say I want the world to be less crappy than it is today. And so right now we're at this, let's say 9 billion land animals, 70 billion globally, trillions of sea animals. And so I want that number to go down. Right now, the United States is eating more meat than ever before, and I want that trend to go in the opposite direction. I don't want animals to be used besides being loved and played with and being celebrated. So I'm not in love with the idea of any suffering for any sentient being. But I know that in order to get to that place, we're going to have to use as many incremental levers as possible. And so right now, 99% or so of for example, in the United States, of the ways in which we raise animals are on factory farms. And there may be these idyllic sort of farms in which they treat the animals nicely and they're more sustainable, part of this regenerative agriculture. And perhaps some of us here have concerns with those kinds of practices because we can't regulate them. They may not actually be as sustainable as they are. There's still slaughter involved ultimately. But regardless, the majority of abuse is coming from these factory farms. And so I simply encourage us to be as pragmatic as possible and move in a positive direction. And if we're ever in a moment in which we diverge, for example, if there's someone in a room who is fine with using animals on these sort of more sustainable farms compared to someone who wants a vegan world, then we can sort of argue then. But right now, we're so far from that, and we really need each other, and we have to work together. I think I have an answer, but I'll turn to you, Jessica, for the...
Yeah, no, I pretty much agree with everything Brian said. I don't, personally, I'm not comfortable with the exploitation of even one animal. But I do find a lot of hope in both plant-based and clean meat because we're seeing big meat companies, Cargill, Tyson, invest in these industries and really diversify their offerings. And so they have power that no one else has to change the food system. And I find that to be very hopeful. On clean meat, the biopsies, so there are biopsies being taken now and cell lines being established now. And one piece of the technical process that I didn't get into any detail on is immortalization of these cell lines, which means that they are they're brought to a state where they're able to reproduce over and over and over and over again over many, many generations. And so we expect that the use of animals will be virtually non-existent for clean meat. Now, what does that mean as far as looking at the food supply generally? I think that from GFI's perspective, the future is one in which there is no mindless meat. There is no meat, like what you get when you go to the drive-through or the deli or your workplace cafeteria, if you're not thinking about anything else other than what's there and what tastes good and what's cheap, it's completely, it's plant-based or clean meat. Does that mean that people might still go to their farmer's market, if they know the local whatever, that may be part of the food supply. It's really hard to tell, and that's such a tiny part of our food supply now that we're focused on the 99%, which is the vast majority of animals who are suffering, the vast majority of environmental impacts. And if we find that we've gotten all of the factory farmed animals taken care of, GFI is going to have to decide what we do about that last segment. But right now, we're focused on the majority. We're focused on the ones who are, being slaughtered and held in captivity now.
Thank you.
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for everything you're doing. My question is, I have friends and family who come in a lot of different flavors, as you were, some from curious about my lifestyle and open to hearing about it to, say, my family in Iowa who see meat eating as a right and something that should happen breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Do you have any suggestions, tips, tricks on how to approach the conversation with them if I do find myself in a spot where it could come up naturally or non-aggressively? Your spiel, as it were, for the people you're talking to, maybe about reducing.
Well, I can hear in your voice how emotional this is for you, and I know how challenging it can be to communicate our dietary choices to others because they're so morally charged. I'm not an expert in effective communication. I do the best that I can. I know the things that have worked well for me are to not make people feel stupid, to speak kindly to people, to come from a loving place, to educate in ways that are compassionate, because it's easy to criticize people for their choices, but we know that there are all of these systems that are in place that make it quite hard for people to do what's not the default, which is kind of the weird thing, is to, in some cases, abstain from animal products or significantly reduce them. I find it very successful to not even talk about the topic at times and just bring my family vegan food, because sometimes it's easier just to delight taste buds than it is to tantalize the ears, I suppose, with our views. So these are just some of the musings that I have in mind, but I think it's really just about approaching it with love and compassion and trying your best not to get angry, which can be really hard at times because we know that there are so many animals that are suffering, and that can enrage us, and I'm sympathetic to that. But we owe this planet and the animals and people's health to do the best possible job that we can do, and that means trying to find ways to find common ground and be effective communicators.
Yeah, I have no special expertise. There was an article in the Washington Post several months ago that was about another social justice issue, and it was all about how people need to bring it to their friends and family and really confront them about their bias. And I asked my boss, Bruce Friedrich, I said, do you confront your friends and family about the exploitation of animals? And he said, hell no, those are the hardest people to talk to. No, focus on what you can achieve and what doesn't deplete your kind of internal resources. And so, I think we live the best lives we can, and families are really, really complicated for so many reasons. I have no advice for you, but lots of empathy.
Would it be okay if I take the second to last question here and to ask Jessica, and then pass it to...
Before we do the last person?
Is that okay?
Yeah, I think we have, so we'll do, Brian will do one question, and then we'll end with your question. Thank you.
What is he going to ask
well,
me?
you asked the question, so I thought it was the polite thing to do. I wonder what you think about the idea that encouraging people to eat either plant-based meats or clean or cultured meat sort of perpetuates the idea that meat needs to be a part of our diet, a main part of our diet. And related to this question is, I think that by and large, not only the food tech space, but also animal advocates have kind of made the claim that we need to distance ourselves from animal issues with respect to the marketing around these products. So primarily, we talk about clean and plant-based meats as being really tasty and healthier, and we don't really get into too much around the confrontation of animal issues. And I imagine a world in which clean meat has taken over the market, for example, but we haven't pushed the horrors of factory farming as kind of this moral impetus. And would perhaps without that awakening, we'll see abuses for other animals or other people or other issues. And so what do you think about that, Jessica?
So an easy question for me to wrap things up. I have so many thoughts on that. It's a great question, Brian. It's one that I struggle with. From GFI's perspective, we really care about the widespread adoption of plant-based and clean meat because it's going to offset the products of conventional animal agriculture. And so we want to talk to people on, about things that they actually care about and that drive their actions. I think from kind of looking at my nutrition background, before coming to GFI, I worked in nutrition policy, and there's all this great research about how people really want to eat well, and they understand fundamentally that it means fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and beans. Most people know that that's basically the foundation of a good diet, and they'll make resolutions the beginning of the year, and then they're just bombarded in these polluted food environments with all sorts of things that don't line up with their very selfish values to be healthy and be a reasonable weight. And so if they can't even do that when they have every self-interest in the world to do it, it's asking a lot of people to carry, health considerations, their considerations for animals and the environment. And I based on the questions we've gotten today, some of you are doing that, and that's remarkable and commendable. But some people just simply don't. And there is an issue of privilege here too. It's much easier for people who are in, economically good place to make choices that are in line with their values and their long-term goals for themselves and their families. It's much, much harder for people who are economically disadvantaged or who are otherwise marginalized. And so, we talk about taste, price, convenience, and that's what we focus on. But I don't want a world in which animals are exploited in some other way. That would be an absurd result. And I don't know that providing people choices that, I don't think that anything we're doing normalizes meat. I think you can have meat and have all of these attributes where it is better for you, the environment, and animals. And kind of ease people's cognitive dissonance because they don't want slaughterhouses right now and they're still eating meat.
And we have time for just one quick last question. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica and Brian. My name is Kartik. I'm from UCLA Law. I want to preface my question, which might sound a little critical, by saying I love both your organizations and I'm a supporter, so I'll just be playing devil's advocate a little bit here. One of the things I'm concerned about on the reducitarian side of things is I like, Brian, the way you characterized it as a label people can use when they're in a transition, but I've seen a lot of people adopt the reducitarian identity as a permanent identity, and in a way it allows them to feel complacent and comfortable with their continued implication and violence towards animals. And one of the things that I find is beneficial about veganism is that really it's not a diet. It's not limited to our food choices. It is fundamentally an ethical stance. It applies to, zoos and rodeos and what you wear and animal testing and all those other sorts of things. And I think we can all agree in the long term, we want to see all of those things addressed. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about how, if reducitarianism can be compatible with that holistic, transformative mission that isn't comfortable with any amount of exploitation, rather than just very small amounts.
Well, I'm so glad we saved by far the best question for the last, and I wish everyone who was interested in sharing a critique did it as eloquently, as kind as you, so I want to commend you for doing that, and that's really important. The first thing I want to say is that I come from a place of humility, that I don't know what the best strategy is for ending factory farming and ending animal agriculture altogether, and there are lots of different perspectives and strategies that the movement as a whole is undertaking. And for me, as long as we understand that and enter into conversations as you did in good faith, then I'm very happy to explore this important question that you asked. So this is referred to as moral licensing, the idea that if you ask someone to do something small or simple, that they might actually do that but then they're going to feel really good about themselves, and so they're not actually going to be encouraged to go greater than that. And the environmental community has been quite concerned about this with respect to recycling, that people recycle and then they feel as though they've done their job with respect to tackling climate change issues. So I am concerned about moral licensing, and I think what we can do is encourage people to recognize that the fewer animal products that they consume, the better, as a way to help mitigate some of those moral licensing issues. But what I want to say is that, or encourage you to sort of invert your critique on yourself, and that is to say that in the same way I'm very concerned about asking people for too little, I'm just as concerned about asking people for too much. Because what often happens is that when you ask people for everything, they give you nothing. And so for all the people in your life that you know are reducitarians or who have cut back a little bit, there are so many more people who have cut back not at all. And so to recognize that if you're going to advance your goal of ending all animal agriculture and abuse, I would encourage you to focus on the people that are eating the largest amounts of animal products, rather than being concerned at all with people who are at least giving it a try.
And we'll end there. So let's take one more.
Thank you.
And now we're going to have,
Can I put in one shameless plug? Thank you all for being here. I was reminded last night when we heard Joanne MacArthur speak that there's a really great film about her called Ghosts in Our Machine. If you haven't seen it, you absolutely need to. And the same filmmaker is making a film on clean meat called Meat the Future, which is coming out in 2020. So mark your calendars for that. She's awesome. Liz Marshall, plug for that.
thanks. And we're going to have now Dean Frosch will help us end our conference.
Thank you, Brian, Jessica, and Kathy. This was a spectacular session to end the conference on, and I really appreciate all the good work that you're doing. And I just want to take a couple of minutes because I want to say a few thank yous. But before I get to that, I just want to reflect on the fact that this is our 26th annual Animal Law Conference. And Kathy and I have the privilege of working together at Lewis and Clark Law School, the Center for Animal Law Studies. And the very first Animal Law Conference was at Lewis and Clark Law School, and it was done by the students at Lewis and Clark Law School. And so we feel very fortunate to be steeped in this history. Every single year, Lewis and Clark has had this conference. And a few years ago, when ALDF was partnered with us on this conference, we were able to grow it even more. So we're grateful to the students and to Lewis and Clark Law School and to ALDF for allowing us the opportunity to do this every year. So thank you to all of those organizations. And speaking of thank yous, I just once again want to say thank you to our sponsors, because without them, this wouldn't be possible. And I'll just go through the list, and maybe we can give them a round of huge applause at the end. But the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights Law and Policy, Chapman, Cubine, and Huss, Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, the National Anti-Vivisection Society, Carolina Academic Press, Wuxley Movement, and of course, Miyoko's. Please, let's give all of them a huge round of applause. I also want to thank the Lewis and Clark Animal Legal Defense Fund Student Chapter. Thank you so much for all of the work that you've done, and they have volunteered, as well as other students, both JD and LLM students, who have volunteered throughout the weekend, and also the ALDF staff who have helped throughout the weekend. Thank you to the Chicago Marriott, especially Brent Ortiz, who was the event manager, Chef Baba and the banquets team, and the entire PSAV team for audiovisual. I also want to give a very special shout out to our conference planning committee, which included Kathy Hessler, Joyce Tischler, Pamela Hart, Priscilla Rader, Raj Reddy, and of course, Liberty Mulcaney, who we all know and love. I also want to give a shout out to Elena Gavonis, who is with ALDF, and she was somebody behind the scenes who just did so much work. So thanks to all of you for the work that you did to plan. So one of the things that we have started doing is we've started alternating our locations. We typically house this in Portland, where Lewis and Clark Law School is, but we decided that we were going to start going around the country because we wanted to be able to be more accessible to a wider audience. So it's been just a thrill to be here in Chicago. Next year, we are going back to Portland, Oregon, and we are holding it at the Portland Art Museum, which is a beautiful facility. And we want all of you to join us there at the 27th Annual Animal Law Conference. And thank you again for your attention, for your dedication, for your passion, for your hard work. Together, we can do so much more for the animals, and I always leave the conference every year feeling inspired and rejuvenated and just ready to tackle all of the problems that we have ahead of us. So thank you for all the work that you're doing. We'll see you next year. Thank you.